Hey everyone, welcome to Praxis, a podcast where we explore how to practice and embody the way of Jesus in our everyday lives. We want to thank you for taking the time to tune in and listen. Today on the show, we're starting a brand new series focusing on our values as a church community. Brene Brown says we can't live into values we can't name. And so naming and living into values shapes the people we become, and as followers of Jesus, we want to become more like Jesus. So today, we hope to provide a basic introduction to the topic of values. What are values? Why do they matter? And how do values help us as a church? In this episode, we also hope to set the stage for the rest of the series where we will be looking at our specific values as a community. All right, so without further ado, here's episode 2 of the Praxis podcast, Why Values Matter. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Mac.
I'm Katie.
And I'm Cameron.
Today, we're starting a new series on our values as a church community, what they are, why they matter, and how they help us follow in the way of Jesus. The reason we wanted to start our podcast with a series on values is because we were actually reflecting on a class we teach. It's called the DNA class. And in that, it's sort of a mission, vision, values course. And we really only get about a few minutes to talk about each one. And yet, as you're going to see in this series, these core values really shape the people we want to become as we follow in the way of Jesus.
Yeah, so we're talking about values. And I don't know about you guys, but when I hear the word values, I just think of like corporate, businessy kind of things.
Yes.
Which I am generally naturally a little resistant to in church, because the church is more than just like an organization of people or like a nonprofit or business or any of that kind of stuff. But I think there are a lot of good things that can come from the corporate or business world that really help us be the people God has called us to be. And I think one of those things are values. So when we talk about values, I'll give a quick definition, a little bit vague, but we'll be able to dial into it as we go. Values are really like guidelines to help us clarify like who we want to be, what we want to do, why we do what we do, and how we go about doing what we do. Like kind of help us clarify what we're supposed to be about and point us in the right direction. And while values come from kind of like a businessy background, like that word core values, every person and every organization has values, whether they admit it or not.
Yeah, Cameron, I love that definition that you shared. Would you mind just repeating that one more time?
Yes. Guidelines to help us clarify who we want to be, what we want to do, why we do what we do, and how we go about doing what we do.
So the who, the what, the why, and the how.
Yes. Now, as followers of Jesus, we, of course, want to be not just be about what we want and what we're looking for, but we also want to be in tune with what God wants and kind of where he's guiding us and the people he wants us to be and the things he wants us to be doing.
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, we would say that our values are to be informed by the life and teachings of Jesus, right? And here's what I would say is that this is where we can often have some blind spots, right? Like we can create a Jesus in our own image. We're all rooted in a social location. And so we all have blind spots when it comes to Jesus. There's this temptation to create a Jesus in our own image. And so I think we need to read broadly. We need to be in dialogue with other people that will help us kind of lean in and get a more accurate depiction of who Jesus is and the kinds of things that he valued. But what would you guys say? Here are some of the things that Jesus values.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because anyone would say, yeah, I want to be like Jesus and value the things that he values. But if we're not seeking out a variety of perspectives on what that means, we could miss something. One value that I think I've honed in on over the past couple of years, taking from Jesus, is just seeing every person as made in the image of God. That's something that at no point in my life would I have disagreed with that. But the whole idea of like the Imago Dei, every single person is created in God's image, no matter the things they do or how terrible they might look to me in some way. God created everyone and he made them in that image, and that should inform how I see people and how I treat them. I am to see everyone with dignity, and that's just something that's been playing out for me more over the past couple of years.
Yeah, and one of my favorite stories in the Gospels is when Jesus is on his way to heal someone, and the woman who had been struggling with bleeding for many years came and touches his cloak, and he values her so much. Like, his value is for her and seeing her as a person, that he stops this important thing that he's doing in order to spend time with her and to talk with her.
Yeah, that's great. So what I hear you saying, Cameron, is one way to look at values is kind of with some maybe skepticism because it feels kind of businessy. But if we can go, everybody has values, really, whether they realize it or not. Even Jesus had values. Mm-hmm. And here are some of the values that we see Jesus embodying and living into. He's valuing every single person that he encounters, right? Maybe love would be another one. He summarizes the entire Bible by saying, love God and love others. And it goes to the cross to embody it, right? Forgiveness and forgiving your enemies, right? Dying for those who are nailing him to a tree, these types of things. One of the things that occurs to me is that oftentimes the things we say we value aren't what we really value. And what brings that out is when we get sort of squeezed, pinched, there's something sort of pressing in on us, and what we say we value isn't what actually comes out. So one thing, as I was thinking about this, was in churches. In churches, most churches I know of would say, hey, we value things like honesty and transparency. And yet, over the past couple decades, we've seen like scandal after scandal, coming to light. And in those moments, if you've ever been in church leadership, you know what it's like to stand in front of a group of people and deliver a difficult message. But it sort of exposes what are the true values in the situation. And what we've noticed, the default is oftentimes the scandal is denied or sort of minimized. It's not as bad as it's being broadcasted to be. Details are left out. There's sort of vague explanations. And in the end, you're kind of left with the impression, well, do we really value honesty and transparency? Or do we value like self-protection and preservation as an organization, right? So some of these same churches, I would imagine, might have honesty and transparency on their website, but in actuality, when they're sort of pressure mounting and a situation sort of pressing in, well, it's actually self-preservation that we value the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's one thing to define values, and the people at those churches may very well on some level agree that honesty and transparency are good things. But if you're not taking the time to be intentional about what it actually means to live into that, when you're pressed, our defaults are typically going to go against our values, right? I think that applies to probably most people as well. Like, my defaults are going to be towards comfort and convenience and instant gratification. And if I'm not taking the time and the space when I'm not pressed to sit back and go, what do I want my life to be about? And who am I when I'm at my best? I'm probably not going to live into my values, because when I am pressed and I'm in the moment, okay, here's an example for me. I tend to be a multitasker, okay? I'm really good at multitasking. I can handle a lot of things and to be really productive. And so it's really easy for me to be like plugged into my phone all the time, checking the news, checking work emails, looking at social media, whatever. When I'm with my kids, that's my default. It's an instant gratification of looking at my phone and getting things done. But if you would ask me what I want to be when I'm with my kids, it's just being present with them, like being undistracted. If I'm not intentional about I'm going to put my phone away so that I can be an undistracted presence with my kids, when I'm pushed, when I'm in that moment and they're getting into it and they're kind of bugging me and I'd just rather tune it out and like get into my phone, I'm not going to make that choice. It's not because I don't value being present with them. It's just because I'm pressed, I'm going to choose the easy thing.
So we've tried to provide a definition of what values are. Everybody has them, whether they realize it or not. Jesus had values. And as followers of Jesus, we want our values to be aligned with Jesus. And yet we've also named, there's a little bit of a tension here, because when anxiety is high, our true values, what we truly value, often sort of leaks out.
Yeah, so I think an important question to ask ourselves is, how do we actually determine our values? Right? Like, we can all sit around and say, yeah, values are great, we should all have them. But how do we actually do the work of deciding what our values are? And I'm sure there are lots of ideas out there on how to do this. I'm sure there are, many consultants that charge a lot of money to come in and tell us how to determine our values. even thinking about myself and, I'm sure many people listening have had those like staff retreat days where you take a whole day to kind of sit around and do some lofty abstract exercise, and there's bagels and coffee, and but after 5 p.m. that day, not much happens with whatever came out of it. So how do we create values that are meaningful and that we can actually live into? One of my favorite authors that speaks to this is Brene Brown, and she's done a lot of work in this area. So she gave some advice on defining your values. And what she says is essentially start with a comprehensive list of many different values. So if you even go on her website, she's got this list of like maybe 100 something potential values, and just kind of read through it. And as you read through it, start to circle what feels important to you. Maybe circle 10, 15. Yeah, this kind of what defines you when you're at your best? What do you want your life to be about? Start really broad, cast a wide net, and then whittle it down by asking 2 key questions. And I really liked these questions. The first one was, does this define me when I'm at my best? And the second one was, is this a filter that I use to make difficult decisions? So does this define me when I'm at my best? And is this a filter that I use to make difficult decisions? So I talked a little bit about that first one when I talked about being an undistracted presence with my kids. And to me, that helped me settle on a value of presence. When I'm around them, I want to be present because being present defines me when I'm at my best. I'm not distracted. I'm not focused on other things. I'm just present. Another one of my values is simplicity. And this one goes more towards that second question. Going back to the example of my kids, when I'm thinking of what we want to do or how we want to spend time, it can be really easy for me to choose something that maybe costs money, going out to eat, or I don't know, going to Target. I'm kind of a fan of Target. Doing something that spends money, that costs money and involves like a lot of activity. But when I really think about the most meaningful times that we have together, it's just like playing in the backyard, like catching bugs. A couple of weeks ago, we went and caught bugs, and the kids had so much fun with it. Playing catch, throwing the ball around with Charlie. And so another value for me that serves as a filter is simplicity. Like when I think about how I want to spend time with my family, I really value simplicity, and I want them to grow to value simplicity. And they have too much stuff anyways. I don't even think they appreciate it.
They just need bugs.
They just need bugs. Mary Poppins and Taylor is what they named them.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think another way that I have found is helpful to name values is thinking about what makes you angry or frustrated when you see it in yourself or in other people. And that means like that usually is an indicator that there's a value, something that you hold really strongly that's being violated. So kind of flipping it and seeing the opposite. So like one of my values would be to challenge myself because I can naturally be a little more complacent and like enjoy comfort. But then when I see that, I get frustrated because I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm wasting so much time or energy or opportunities to grow. And so that's a value that I look at every week to say like, okay, even if there's hard things coming up, like I really value challenging myself, even if it feels uncomfortable or unnatural in the moment. I want to step into that challenge and not just avoid it.
Yeah. So I think the initial question was how does someone or maybe a group of people determine their values? And I think there are a lot of great resources to do that, to guide you through a process individually or as a group of people to determine what those values are. And in fact, we've been doing some of that work as a staff over the last few months, following sort of a specific process. Cameron, you've been kind of leading the charge, and it's been a lot of fun. In this series, over the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about some of our core values as a church. And I regret to inform our listeners that we didn't follow a really cool process to sort of land on our values as a church. The truth is, we were in sort of a messy season in a messy chapter in our church story, and we were kind of approaching a DNA class a mission, vision, values class for new members, and we felt like we really need to nail this down. What are our values? And the pastoral team came together, and we basically had one sort of filter for throwing out some ideas. And it was like, these are things we actually have to say we embody. They can't be aspirational. These, whatever we agree on, they have to be things that we can say, man, we really live this out. And we came up with 6 of them, and those are the ones we're going to be talking about. Now, the advantage to that was they're not just aspirational things that don't mean anything. Like these, as we get into this series, you're going to see these really have a lot of teeth, some grit to it. We've given a lot of thought about what they mean and how to practice them together. On the flip side, I think the downfall of not having a more lengthy process is that it would have been nice to include more people in that on the front end.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mac, you say these are all things we're doing and aren't aspirational. But, I mean, I don't know. I feel like with values, there's always like an aspirational element to them.
Yes, and I agree with that. We'll never be able to perfectly embody a value. There will always be growing that we need to do. My friends Tricia Taylor and Jim Harrington at The Leader's Journey, they define a core value as something where we have unconscious competency in it, some degree of mastery. Like we're actually living into this now, and we're able to do so with a high level of competency. And so I think what you're getting at, Cameron, is yes, we'll never be able to perfectly embody our values because we're human beings and we always have growing to do. But it does sort of raise this question of what do you do with values to ensure they're not just aspirational, but you're actually living into them? Because there's nothing worse than going through a lengthy process as a team and, several months or a long retreat or whatever, coming up with a list of values, and then nothing's done about them. And this is most organizations. Research shows that about 90% of organizations talk a big game about their values, but they don't really live them out. And this was sort of our staff for a long time. I remember years ago, before both of you were on our staff team, we went through several months of a long process of determining our core values as a staff. We ended up having 8 of them, which is probably too much. And I mean, months and months of dialogue and so on. In the end, what ended up happening is we had these 8 values. They were put in a picture frame and hung above the printer, assuming like this is a place where everybody has to use the copier and the printer. But it kind of like, you go in and you get your copy or whatever, and it's like this list of values is sort of just laughing at you now because we spent so much time trying to figure out what they should be, and then they just ended up on the wall. Nobody talked about them anymore. They felt aspirational. And when you have that, when that's the norm, where you have these values but no one's living into them, they're largely forgotten or just aspirational, a deep sense of cynicism can sort of like become pervasive in the organization because it feels like, well, we don't really do this. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question to you is, to both of you, is how do you move from lofty aspirations to actual practice, embodying these values that we say we agree to?
Yeah, I think for me sometimes, so like I guess I've done this every few years, kind of sat down and tried to discern, okay, are these the values that God still wants me to keep front and center? And every once in a while I'll sit down and think, okay, are there any things like big picture, like or practices that I need to work on? But to me, the most fruit I have found has just been in keeping them in front of me consistently. So like once a week, just as a part of my kind of catching up on email and doing all that other stuff I do, I take just like 30 seconds to look at them, remember like why these are important, and just spend some time reflecting on, okay, God, is there anything here that, how far off course am I? Do I need to do anything to prioritize these more, or just kind of keep them front and center?
Yeah, so I hear you saying you've got to keep them in front of you. You've got to have regular feedback loops where you're returning to them, sort of holding them up and asking questions about how well am I actually living into these things. Mm-hmm. What about you, Katie?
Yeah, for me, I think it's helpful to build in practices or rhythms that just ensure that I'm going to be implementing these practices in my everyday life, right? To help something that I can do easily and periodically, that it's not going to, feel like this big intentional effort to have to live into it. So for example, our family tries to do a Sabbath on Friday nights when we can. And we've just kind of made that a regular rhythm. We don't do it every week, and sometimes not even every other week, but we put it on the calendar when we can, and we've just built it into like a regular rhythm with our family. And now our kids look forward to it. When Thursday rolls around, they ask, hey, are we doing Sabbath tomorrow night? And when it comes around, we put our phones away, we keep the TV off, and we have some other routines that we incorporate into that day, and that helps me to live into that value of presence and simplicity.
So I've heard two things. One is, Katie, you said specific practices that sort of help us embody these values. Cameron talked about then having regular feedback loops where we're returning to them and evaluating how we're doing. I wrote those two things down as well, and then I had two others. One is guiding principles. And so going back to our friends at the Leader's Journey, they say a core value is an area where you're living into it with some degree of competency, like a high degree of competency. A guiding principle, on the other hand, represents a standard you want to live into that targets the gap between your core value and where you currently are. So, for instance, if let's say we value love, right? And I notice areas where I'm falling short in the area of love, I might develop a guiding principle that targets that gap. And that helps me, if I get really specific about here's what the value is and here's how I plan to live into that to close that gap, it helps me helps me get closer to that core value.
So what's an example of what a guiding principle would be for you?
Yeah, so one guiding principle I'm living into right now is play, which sounds really funny maybe to some people, but I am very much a work first, play second kind of person. I bring a lot of intensity to the things I do, and I could just keep going nonstop. And I'm not at my best when I'm just going. I know that I'm actually at my best when I'm more spontaneous and free to stop and play and enjoy the people around me. And so I've just named that as a guiding principle. I want to practice play on a regular basis, both intentionally and with some degree of spontaneity. And there's probably a joke around the office because I always announce when I'm doing something fun or playful to stop. But I could sit and just keep going all day. And so, for instance, I think it was last week or the week before, it was National Cinnamon Roll Day.
Yes.
Yes. Cameron, you love to bake, and you brought in cinnamon rolls for everybody. Without my guiding principle of play, I probably would not have had a cinnamon roll. But smelling the cinnamon rolls from my office, hearing the laughter coming out of the, office area.
Did you have like 3 by the end of the day?
Yeah, I just went for it. And that's an example. Like I'm learning how to be not just driven and disciplined and kind of nose to the grindstone, but I'm learning how to be more spontaneous and playful, and it rounds me out as a human being. So that'd be an example. So the other thing I wrote down that I wanted to share is when we fail to keep our values. So I think this is when cynicism really starts to set in a relationship or in an organization, is when we have a core value, that core value is not lived into or is violated in some way, and then nothing said about it. Like deep skepticism among a staff can begin to set in when core values are regularly stomped on. And I think that when we don't live up to a core value individually or as a team, and we own that and name it, it's a way of honoring our value even when we fall short of it. So for instance, like I try not to ever raise my voice with my boys. But if there's moments when I get too intense with them and I don't acknowledge that can just become normative. But when I stop and say, hey, listen, I got way more intense than I wanted to in that moment. That is not the kind of presence that I want to have with you. I'm honoring that value even when I didn't live into it in that moment. And I'm calling myself back to that core value, right?
Yeah, that takes some courage to do, right? It's easier for all of us just to kind of keep our head down and act like it never happened.
For sure. But then the more that happens, the further out of reach that core value becomes. And I think one of the ways we is to re-up our commitment to it by confessing when we weren't able to do it.
Yeah, and especially I think that's important in an organization. You talked about the values that sat at the printer. So I have a compliance background. I used to work in compliance at the university system. And one of the things we talked about often was tone at the top. So if you have a value and you actually want it to be a real value, like the people on the top, the people in leadership have to embody that value. You can't just put it on a piece of paper and have all your employees sign it. And then they look around and wonder why, the executives aren't held to that standard, but they're supposed to be. Well, that's not going to mean anything, right? I think it's even more important the higher up you are within an organization or even within your family. It's really important for you to embody that value if you want your kids to embody that value. And when the people at the top, the executives, the parent figures screw up, I think that it models honesty and integrity to be able to admit that. I like that.
I would say that that's where some of the greatest breakthrough happens, is when those in positions of leadership or of some degree of power fail to live into a core value, and they go and they name that and they confess it. They get present to the impact it had on those around them, and they recommit themselves to whatever is necessary to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Okay, so to summarize, when we talk about navigating the tension of actual versus aspirational values, I heard us mention 4 things. Cameron, you mentioned the importance of keeping values in front of you. I think you said you look at them, every week or a couple times a week. I talked about the importance of having practices that just help us embed the values into our everyday lives. Mac, you talked about the importance of guiding principles to close any gaps that exist. And then the 4th one that you brought up, which I just love, is the importance of acknowledging when we fail to live into our values, and specifically having a conversation about the impact that may have had and owning that. So the next thing I want us to talk about is just what the values are to knowing and living into a set of shared values. Like, what does this actually do for us besides just providing some good material for a podcast or something to do on a staff retreat? How was our life actually improved by being guided by values? How was our workplace or our organization changed in some meaningful ways by identifying values and by having practices that help us live into them? And Cameron, you told us a story recently about a book you read about Patagonia and the work that they did to identify some values, and I was hoping you could share that with us.
Yeah, it was a book called Let My People Go Surfing, written by the founder of Patagonia. I cannot pronounce his name, Yvon Chouinard or something like that. But it was a great book. It's like part his story of founding the company, and then a giant chunk of it is just their company values. They give this to all their employees. And part of the idea is that these values help provide clarity when making difficult decisions about things. So like, for example, one of their values is sustainability, and they believe in it so much that the idea is that any employee at any point in the production chain or in marketing or whatever, if there's a sustainable option and a profitable option, like they have full permission to like make the sustainable choice in order to live into that. And so it provides clarity when they're like, I'm not sure what to do with these 2 things that I have in front of me.
What I love about that? It sounds like it's really empowering to the staff, right? So the fact that they have values and that people know about them empowers them to make decisions on their own that are consistent with the values. And you think about the flip side of that, it's like if you're an employee and maybe you're kind of down the line and you don't know which decision to make, you're going to be constantly going back to your manager going, well, what should I do here? What should I do here? And in some ways, you're going to be less empowered because you don't know what the organization values.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes, they have to go back and maybe make a different decision. But it really frees people up to know, like, I'm not going to get in trouble for making this choice.
Yeah.
I think another benefit to having established values, especially among a team, is that it builds trust and rapport. So for instance, let's say there's a value around engaging conflict in a transformative way and avoiding gossip and triangles and things like that. Like, we talk to each other, not about each other when things get messy. That'd be like a value. And let's say there's a relational tension between me and someone else comes and talks to me about it with emotional maturity and all the things that, are needed to work through conflict in healthy ways. That immediately amplifies my trust in that other person. Like, I see them living into it. I know, okay, this is a person, when they have a problem with me, they're going to come talk to me about it, et cetera, rather than talk to someone else about it. And it really, when people do that together, there's a sense in which it just builds trust and confidence in one another that we're actually saying what we're doing. And I've been part of teams where we would say we value engaging conflict in a transformative way, but the truth is there's rampant gossip and all sorts of triangles and all this stuff, and it destroys the trust within a team.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And a lot of teams, I think, would say that they do that, but they actually don't. I imagine that's pretty common.
Yep. So what else? What other benefits would you say exist when you're really operating out of a sense of core values, either individually or as a team?
I think for me, one of the things that sticks out is that it frees me up to say no to other things. So when I try to whittle my values down to just 2 or 3 things, I'm leaving out a lot of things that are actually very good things. It doesn't mean that other values don't matter, but they're not my top values. And so going back to my example of just, being present with my kids, maybe answering emails is a good thing on some level, right? Like it's good to be responsive and it's good to be tuned in with the news or whatever else I might be doing on my phone, but I'm choosing something that's better. And because I'm choosing to be present with my kids and putting my phone down, it frees me up to say no to these other good things, even if it's a family member that wants to talk or a friend that wants to text. Again, they're not bad things that compete for my attention, but I won't feel freed up to say no to those things if I'm not clarifying my values.
Yeah, I think when we think of our church and our church community values, is that having them, clarified and that we talk about them, it keeps them front and center, like the most important things. It can just be really easy as a group of people or as individuals to get sidetracked and kind of just focused on things that don't matter as much.
Yeah, so it keeps us on track. I think another one is it just creates a shared sense of accountability among a team of people. Mm-hmm. Because we said we value these things, well, now we can, people can hold each other to those things no matter where they are on the org chart, right? I'll give an example, not from our staff team or our church, but in marriage. Josie and I, early on in our marriage, we had to learn how to fight fairly. When we had a disagreement, what does it look like to navigate disagreement with mutual respect and love? And one of the guiding principles that we landed on was we will not walk out on each other in the middle of an argument, which is different from a break. There might be times where we're just needing a break to calm down or to get some space and to pray and think through things so we can return in a productive way. But one of our guiding principles was we don't just walk out on each other in the middle of an argument because we're too frustrated or whatever, unless it's agreed upon. Well, that becomes like a shared sense of accountability now, because if we have, 17 years later, if we have a disagreement or if we're in the middle of a conflict and it is getting too tense and the other person wants to walk away, well, the other person is now in a position to go, no, we agreed not to do that.
Sure. Yeah, another way I think that plays out is with the 3 of us. We've come to an agreement about some values that we want to guide how we work together. The 3 of us as the executive team here. And one of those is giving each other the benefit of the doubt. And how I've seen this play out is, if something happens, I think a natural human reaction is to think, well, how can this person do that? Like, are they just trying to frustrate me, or why would they do this? But when you're actually giving someone the benefit of the doubt, you're saying, I'm going to fill in whatever gaps I have in my understanding to that person's benefit until I have the chance to talk to them. So I'm not going to stew in frustration or anger. I'm not saying that I do that with you guys. But no matter what happens, you're choosing to take the most favorable interpretation until you have that conversation that needs to be had with emotional maturity.
One of the things that occurred to me, especially as we go back to the beginning part of our conversation, where when you're under pressure, when there's anxiety and you're sort of squeezed, your true values come out. I think having a solid set of core values helps you in those moments of anxiety still make the right decision. So rather than pivoting out of reactivity or other variables that might be pressing in on you, it really gives you clarity to not just to know the right thing, but to do the right thing. And I think it's really important in this day and age for leaders as individuals, but also churches as a whole. We're living in anxious times, and there's so many variables that are acting upon church communities right now that it'd be easy to sort of pivot or react to those in ways that are less than helpful. And I think churches that really have their core values mapped out, they're embodying those things. When those pressure points hit, they'll still be able to stay true to who they want to be.
The one other kind of point I had was just how, the idea that a lot of people when they're nearing kind of the end of life, or they get like a scary medical diagnosis, they all of a sudden seem to have some clarity around what's important and how they want to live their life. And I see this whole discussion about values as us sort of saying, you don't have to wait until you're at the end of your life or you get, that diagnosis to sit back and say, what's important to me? And how do I live in line with that? Because if we don't do the work to think about those things, we're going to live on autopilot.
Yeah.
Right? We're just going to do the things that feel comfortable or convenient. And so this is us sort of doing the hard thing. Like this conversation isn't easy, and it's not easy to live into values, but we're doing it because we're saying these are the things that matter, and this is what we want our life to be about, and this is what we want our church to be about.
Yeah, and I've noticed that like those end of life things, oftentimes there's layers of regret. Mm-hmm. When people are maybe getting some clarity about how they wish they had lived, or values they wish they had embodied, there's a sense of regret. My dad goes on a silent retreat twice a year, and this last time he was on a silent retreat, it was in August, he sent me a text right afterwards saying how proud he was of me. And I thought, he's getting some time away to reflect on what's important to him, the people that matter, how he wants to speak into their life. And I realized in that moment, like, I do the same thing. Like when I get away on that silent retreat once a year, like I get renewed clarity on my marriage, on my parenting, work stuff. Like it does. It's hard work to get away and to really reflect and then get specific about how, like, any changes that need to be made.
Yeah. And it makes sense, right? Because when we're in the day-to-day, there are so many things competing for our attention, and there's so much noise that can kind of drown out what's really important.
So you're not going to land on your core values as you're scrolling through Facebook?
Probably not.
Or scrolling through Facebook while making dinner and trying to be present to your kids, right, Katie?
And answering emails.
And
listening to a podcast.
Right.
I think the big takeaway for today is that we all have values, whether we realize it or not. We are all operating out of our values. And when our values are clear to us, and especially clear to a group of people, they can serve to guide us and keep us faithful to our mission and vision, especially when we're experiencing pressure, internal or external, to go a different direction.
Yeah, so as we close out, here are some steps and some reflection questions with the goal of helping you identify your own values to live into. So first, I would just ask, what are your values? If you could identify, say, 3 to 5 of your own, what would they be? We mentioned Brene Brown has a great resource. There are many others out there, too, that can help you along the way. And then how well are you living into those values? Are they lived values or are they aspirational? And when you're not living in alignment with your values, how do you know? What are those signposts that will tell you that you're out of sync with your values? And then how do you get back on track? How do you course correct? How do you do what Matt was talking about and owning, hey, I wasn't living out of my values there and I'm sorry. And then I would ask, what values do you assume that the church should embody? When you're looking at a church that you want to be a part of or any other institution or organization, what are you looking for? What makes you say, yeah, I want to be a part of that? That's something I can get on board with. And then why? Why are those values important to you?
All right. Thanks so much for joining us today for our next episode, episode 3. We're going to start doing a deep dive into some of our core values as a church community. We're going to start with the value of holistic discipleship. And then in the following weeks, we're going to look at spirit sensitivity, team leadership, generosity, participation, and finally, the value of reconciliation. So I hope you will continue to join in. Thanks so much for listening today, and we will see you next time. Praxis is recorded and produced at Crosspoint Community Church. You can find out more about the show and our church at crosspointwi.com. If you have any questions, comments, or have any suggestions for future topics, feel free to send us an email. Also, if you enjoyed the show, consider leaving a review. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.